Joining us now from the United States is scientist, engineer, entrepreneur and independent Senate candidate in 2018 for Massachusetts, Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai. Dr. Ayyadurai is an MIT PhD. Controversially, he claims to be the inventor of email. We'll ask him about that. But he has recently been exposing quite brilliantly, you can find him on YouTube, who will profit from climate change action, why it's a hoax, and why it was right that President Trump pulled out of Paris. Welcome to Outsiders, Shiva. How are you, Doctor?
I'm great. Great to be on the show.
Fantastic. Great to have you here. Now, listen, tell us, as I said, you have forensically analysed what the Paris Agreement is all about and why it is such a hoax. Can you talk us through it, Shiva?
Sure. You know, I used to teach a course at MIT called Systems Visualization, where we would take very complex systems and then figure out how to explain it to people in very simple ways. So the Paris Climate Accords, in some ways, was my sort of doing, what I do well, which is taking very complex systems and essentially deconstructing it, but also showing how the parts interconnect. So when you really look at the Paris Accords, as I talk about, today, if you have a business or you do something, or, the activities that humans do, there's a certain amount of CO2 being produced. After as a result of the Paris Accords, particularly after 2030, that same process goes on. But the difference is every man, woman, and child is going to be essentially taxed, a carbon tax. And that is essentially what the fundamentals of the Paris Accords was. It's not about lowering pollution, but it's fundamentally about enslaving more people to essentially pay tax. And a large part of that tax is going to profit, as you guys have mentioned, an aristocracy or an elite, because the Paris Accords incense people to pollute. And after 2030, these carbon credits, which are traded on the markets, are going to skyrocket in price. So the quote unquote IPC, which really represents these very elite globalists, are going to make a ton of money off of this, trillionaires, not billionaires. So, it was very important Trump pulled out of it, because these people essentially were engineering the United States to put $100 billion into the Green Fund. And that Green Fund was fundamentally payoff money to many of the consultants across these countries. Because frankly, many of these countries did not want to be part of the Paris Accords. So the consultants essentially manipulated the leadership to say, oh yeah, this is a good thing. But the most ridiculous thing about this whole thing is China, which at the time was polluting 11 billion carbon tons, this was 2 years ago, was allowed to go up to 22 billion carbon tons. And so what is basically saying pollute, continue polluting, in fact, double your pollution, because by 2030, you're going to have to buy a lot of carbon credits. And so you can imagine what that'll do to the price of everyday goods to the ordinary worker. It's going to escalate that price, and every person is going to pay more. And then a small set of elite people are going to become trillionaires. So that's what that entire diagram showed. And I think what people enjoyed about it, it's something that they could do on a napkin, they could show, but it essentially shows these very intricate systems working together against everyday working people.
So the way it works is basically this green fund is set up, which all the Western countries pump money into, and that is then distributed to all these other countries who have signed up to the Paris Agreement knowing they're going to get a ton of money coming their way, all financed by the taxpayers of the Western democracies, the consumers of the Western democracies, for whom all goods will be much more expensive, and yet we don't end up with any less carbon, or arguably it doesn't work. So this is a money-making scheme. Who's behind it? Who benefits from the carbon credits?
Well, if you look at it, it's essentially a finite set of people. You can use names like Al Gore, but as you have said, it's these globalists, essentially a set of people who want to essentially interconnect these economies into a global bureaucracy. They benefit because carbon, as we know, is everywhere. What better thing to convert all of human economics to a single variable, which is carbon? And so then as you start deconstructing this, you actually find out the science is highly flawed. Because if you actually look at the situation, I think they've made people pro-CO2, anti-CO2. CO2 is not a pollutant, and they've distracted people from the effects of lowering pollution. So we actually are encouraging pollution. We know more pollution, dust particles in the air actually do affect climate negatively. But that's not what the issue was. The issue was to lower carbon. So they moved the entire discourse to attacking carbon, and CO2 is not a pollutant. And I think you may know what happens when the CO2 levels go below like 200 or 180, right? Parts per million. All life on the planet essentially goes away.
Yes.
So they have, so the entire model has been to distract people, not to focus on pollution, encouraging pollution, spin it into this environmental aspect as though you're helping the world. Now, one of the interesting things is typically if you come out against, this nonsense, they try to frame you as a climate denier, right? Pro-climate, anti-climate.
Yep.
And that's the other aspect of this whole thing, to divide people up into pro-climate and anti-climate. And that division also further causes more chaos. I think one of the interesting things with me is, I'm actually a quote unquote environmentalist. There's, I've supported things to, clean water, clean air, clean food. And the other interesting thing is one of the big companies who's part of this globalist aspect is Monsanto. Monsanto actually supports climate change. You can go to their website, but they dirty the water, they pollute our food, and they dirty the air. They're forgotten about this in this equation because the academics who support a lot of this, there's a book I have coming out called Climate of Science, and when you unravel, I mean, I didn't have a chance to go into that in that video. When you go one layer deeper, you find out that science itself has been compromised. It's gone from the scientific method to scientific consensus. So it's pay to play science right now, even places like MIT and Harvard. And this is why a guy like Jeffrey Epstein was able to do quite well there, because he's essentially, I hate to use the word, but he's a pimp. And the major educational leaders essentially pimp out their academics to do fake science. So you have what's really behind fake news is fake science. So in some ways, fake science is a fake news behind the fake news. And unfortunately, this is what is going on globally. That academia.
If it's that simple, then why do we have the overwhelming majority of scientists, not 97%, we know that figure is not accurate, but nevertheless, the majority of scientists saying that the science on climate change is sound, many saying it's settled, there is a consensus. What is your response to that? Because if we're to accept what you're saying, there's almost this global conspiracy, and I think a lot of people have trouble believing that there is a conspiracy where so many people are involved. What's your response to that?
Well, the response is very simple. In the United States, for example, in 1970, there was an amendment called the Mansfield Amendment that was passed. Fundamentally, what that amendment did, it essentially moved a lot of money into institutions like the National Science Foundation, which were highly political institutions. And that was a big inflection point in academic research, because what it did was it actually supported those people who were not real scientists, but academics, essentially scientists who were good at bringing in money. So what's fundamentally happened is science has become the oldest profession. A colleague of mine who's become a good friend, Dick Lindzen, he was the head of the meteorology group at MIT. Dick, which a friend who I've just started becoming more recently, Dick actually wrote to Trump and said, pull out of the Paris Accords. 100+ professors at MIT denounced Professor Lindzen. Lindzen is one of the leading physicists. He's one of the leading, applied mathematicians in the world. By the way, there's no field called climate science. It's a bogus field.
Exactly.
Climate is actually fluid mechanics and radiative physics. So overnight, what's happened is there's $2 billion in impact grants. So if you put climate change in bed bugs, you'll get funded. So MIT gets around $20 to $40 million in these grants. So that's why they had to hit a guy like Lindzen. So we can talk about conspiracy, but much more simple is follow the money.
Exactly.
In academia today, mediocre academics who are not that bright get elevated into these very tenured positions.
So this is the question that I have, though. I'm just trying to get my head around, number one, what the actual economics of what they're trying to achieve here is going to look like in a post-2030 world. I mean, how do these credits wind up creating this sort of socialist type of thing? What's the control levers that are exerted on the economy? And just quickly, are we talking about conspiracy, or are we talking about culture? Is it just simply a self-reinforcing culture that's happening in academia where people just realize, oh, well, people are into climate, so if I stick the word climate on my study about bed bugs or coffee mugs or whatever it is, that's just what's going on?
Well, I think it's probably both going on. There probably is a larger conspiracy to consolidate power, as you call globalism, among an aristocratic elite. And this is global, this is occurring everywhere. Now, the way that you execute on that is to essentially incent academics with money. So both is occurring on that side. You know, if you look at scientific consensus, there's nothing in science called scientific consensus. Remember, there was 99 people who thought the sun went around the earth, and one guy had evidence saying that was not true. What's wonderful about real science, it goes beyond your opinion. There's a lot of people can have opinions all day, but science is based on facts. If you actually go and look at the details of these models, which attempt to model a very, very complex system and reduce it to one variable, CO2, you find out none of the models actually match up. So the way that they resolve that, because fundamentally evidence is, you know, reproducible predictions. F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration, always works, right? For example, if you go read the IPCC report, you'll find out that they have 40 different predictions of Arctic ice sheet melting. It's one for whatever flavor you want, 0% to 100% and everything in between. It's like you're at an ice cream store. That is not science. It's indeterminate. It's indeterminacy. So when you cannot resolve science with real science, you enforce scientific consensus, which is nonsense. So I think we're at a very important turning point in human history, because it's no different than the Council of Trent, what they did to Galileo. In the United States, there's a guy called Chuck Schumer who's trying to push a bill in Congress which says that there will be no more discourse on climate change because it's settled. So these people have no idea what they're talking about.
Absolutely.
So I think, yeah. So the good news is working people, you talked about them earlier, get it. Everyday working people, a plumber, electrician, an engineer, a nurse, these people do not buy it because they actually have to work with nature's laws every day. They have to, you know, deal with reality. The people who are not getting it are the educated, vulnerable elites. Because if you're a student, you go to college, you have a $200,000 loan, and then you have to get a good grade. So you simply accept what your professor says. And so the professors are accepting, they basically follow the money. So you have a very interesting trail in academia where there's no real critical thinking anymore. And for that matter, science itself is compromised. And this is very, very favorable to people who want to, you know, shun freedom of discourse, right? And so the way you stifle this is you eliminate freedom, you eliminate debate, therefore truth can never come out.